Okay. Okay, we're ready for countdown.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Pull to Refresh podcast. We began having these conversations with the goal of forming our XPRIZE team, and we continue to explore ideas that may become the most impactful sustainability solutions. I'm Laurel Tincher. This episode features a recording of our Clubhouse room with special guest Apoorv Sinha, CEO of Carbon Upcycling Technologies and participant in the previous Carbon XPRIZE. Apoorv was interviewed by our CEO, Arin Crumley.
So, Apoorv, can you start by giving us some of the context that brought you to where you are and what you're working on? Like, how did that come about? We don't all roll out of bed and then think suddenly, let's do carbon upcycling. I guess some of us do, though. A lot of us in this room do.
Some of us do.
But before that was happening, can you tell your story a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad Serena kind of chimed in there and said some of us do, because I do think that one of the invigorating things about being involved in the field recently has been to see how many bright, talented, and motivated people have started coming in. My personal work in carbon utilization and such began about 6.5 years ago, primarily as a response to an open innovation grant that the Alberta government was running up here in Canada. And they took a pretty cool approach, actually. I was just coming off my undergrad in chemical engineering. I had just moved up to Canada, and I was looking at different career options, I suppose. And then the call specifically had requested proposals around carbon utilization and beneficiation. They were looking at pathways that were at any stage of development and pretty low bar in terms of like where you had to be in terms of technology de-risking and such. And luckily, we were able to put in a proposal that ended up getting some money. We got not an insignificant amount of money to get the venture off the ground. And it feels like ages ago now, because we've been able to make quite a bit of headway in terms of scale up and market validation since. But really, that was when it became more than just a hobby, because we actually had money to play with and test new ideas. I think personally, just to kind of take another perspective in answering that question, my dad has been in the energy sector for a long period of time. Like he's actually a petroleum engineer. He's just on the verge of retirement right now, but he's worked in India, in the Middle East, and also done a few gigs in North America. And I think it's really interesting to see how generationally there's a big shift in how people are viewing energy systems. Like back even 10 or 15 years ago, folks in Texas and Alberta and many parts of the world where there is a lot of oil and gas, they kind of looked at that as, where they would go career-wise. And there wasn't really much of an internalization of some of the implications of those decisions. And I think now, especially in the last 7 or 8 years, people have realized two things that have kind of both culminated in the type of kind of movement towards clean tech that we're seeing, I think. One is that, this notion or paradigm that getting a stable job with a company like Shell or BP is the best thing you can do with your career. For a lot of bright engineers in Egypt, in Kuwait, in the UK even, right? They used to look at that as a job for life. You're going to do well, you're going to travel around the world, you're going to see all these things, you're going to stay at fancy hotels. And that was kind of what they were chasing professionally. And I think that myth has now kind of shattered. And secondly, I think people have realized that even for the folks that are still able to do that and work in energy as an industry, there's a way to do that is still compatible with creating a sustainable world. Whereas, previously that was, I guess in one sense, a a paradox that they were happy to live with. Like, they understood that it was creating issues, but they were able to kind of put that to the wayside when they went to work. And now I think it's becoming a lot more of a comprehensive picture and something that's more difficult to avoid. So even within these companies, I think there's a lot more of a change of foot where, you know, people are asking tougher questions. There are activists in the boardroom and also in you know, the employee base. And I think that all bodes well. Like, change doesn't happen overnight. And the more people in all aspects of the energy system that get excited about this, I think the better our odds are of actually creating systemic change.
Well, that's a very cool kind of overview in terms of I mean, I like how you're talking about even the goals, that people's goals would be shifting as the world's shifting, values are shifting, industries are shifting. So, and it's great that Alberta was offering that. And you know, can you disclose more? You're like, it was not a small sum of money. I mean, look, we're all friends here. This is Clubhouse.
Yeah.
You can tell us.
I mean,
What are we talking about there?
Yeah, it was $500,000 Canadian dollars. It was only like 10 grand US basically with the exchange rate. But it actually was, you know, jokes aside, a significant chunk of money. Like, it wasn't, you know, the kind of pitch competition money of 10 or 20 grand, which gives you some money, but not enough to really, you know, hire a workforce and I say workforce, like, you know, even a couple of employees steadily to create 2 or 3 year plans. I think that's one of the things that I've been a major advocate of. Like, you know, the certain kind of government agencies in Canada and the province that we touch base with on a regular basis, I keep pitching to them the extreme value, you know, like the great rate of return that they get every time they put, you know, 100K or more towards a new concept. Because, you know, in the grand scheme of things, when they're talking to companies like GE in the States, or, you know, you think of the auto bailout a few years ago, I mean, you know, you're talking billions of dollars just before you even get into the boardroom to negotiate, right? But there is a reticence, I think, for people to do many small bets. So, like, I've been a major advocate of, you know, many small bets, and not too small though. Like, and I think like 10 to 20K would be too small. I think 100 to 200K, you know, littering that across, you know, 50 or 100 startups, to me is a really, really cool approach, because it gets a whole bunch of motivated people involved and engaged in the market. So, you know, if they're already motivated to do something in clean technology and carbon, like the carbon cycle work, this gives them enough resources to do something real, instead of, you know, getting the check and thinking about like how to match that or whatever, you know. And I think the second thing it does is it really creates a sense of momentum where, you know, you can get closer to a tipping point or a threshold of market engagement and kind of size where it builds up its own motive force. You know, 10 or 20 people, like if I think of like back in 2014, you know, they gave 24 companies that $500,000 grant. I can almost assuredly tell you that about 10 of those haven't done anything particular in, you know, since then. But that's not a bad thing. Like, I don't think that needs to be looked at as a negative. What that does mean is, like, to me, that's a sign that maybe they should have taken 10 times more bets, and then they would have had, like, let's say 4 or 5 of those companies still going well and have raised way more money since then. You know, you would have 10x that, and that's still, frankly, a fraction of what you need to be able to tackle this carbon emission problem. So, I don't know. Overall, I think that there isn't just an issue with how many funds people put in, but also how they put them in. And I'm definitely more of like the micro, you know, funding kind of school of thought versus give 5 or 6 of the big guys a huge chunk of money and let them figure it out. Like, I don't think that has worked super well for us in general over the last 40, 50 years.
Well, and I mean, we could even go back farther. I mean, the question is, how do you innovate? And how do you incent innovation? Basically, how do you fund innovation? I think most people are pretty happy with the general mechanics of capitalism. Like, it's nice to have some reward for your effort, but you've spent obviously a lot of time thinking about how do you fund innovation. So that seems to indicate that you're somebody who is probably innovative. That's the vibe I'm getting, because and for anyone who is, that introduces this immediate problem of like, well, so I guess we live in a world that rewards everything that's already working. So maybe I should work on everything that's already working. And then it's like, nah, I can't do that. I want to work on something that isn't working yet. That's exciting. And then look for, where there's a need. And so we've all come to, obviously, this arena because there's clearly a need for innovation right now in this arena. So my question is what is that innovation? What is it that you're working on? And, can you give us your big picture vision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and I'll definitely do that, but I'd love to see some reciprocation there and learn more about you guys as well. Like, I've looked at your website and would just love to hear from you and your team, Arin, like as to what you're up to as well. But just to do my part first. So Carbon Upcycling is basically a carbon utilization company. Our overall vision is to be the enabler of what we call the carbon age. Like we, obviously know about like the Iron Age, the Stone Age and things like that. And, a lot of times we have referred to the age, at least within our team, that we live in today as the information age, where a lot of the work that we do and the lives we live are in this digital kind of world. We think that with the massive number of carbon emissions that we have to tackle between now and 2100, the only chance we have of being able to do that is taking, a fairly high level approach in defining the problem. And we see that as ushering this carbon age where every supply chain, every material supply chain in the world involves the sequestration of carbon as opposed to release of carbon. And to achieve that goal, I think, you need systemic change. Like we see ourselves as one of the tools or a set of tools that are being provided by our core technology to achieve that. And really what we're doing is we have a low energy process to take carbon emissions, like gaseous carbon emissions, and solidify them into solid materials that could either be industrial byproducts or wastes from industrial processes, or essentially be minerals that are abundantly available in the world and can be extracted without a high carbon or environmental footprint. What we've found over the last 5 years is that we've actually shown a whole range of a whole portfolio of materials can be activated through this catalytic reaction. So we can take, for example, ash left behind by coal power plants and activate them chemically so that they can absorb CO2. We've taken minerals such as talc, wollastonite, a whole bunch of minerals that are used by the cement industry currently to create low carbon construction materials. And we found that we can actually sequester carbon in those and further enhance their performance in the end use, like in concrete or construction projects that you see around the world. And we've also found that this can actually float into, or the technology and its associated materials are applicable to a whole range of other industries as well. Like, when you see panels in your car, for example, you don't necessarily associate the use of minerals in that, but most of those car panels or even the plastic bags you use, or you might use, like hopefully you don't, but the ones that do use plastic packaging and stuff, a lot of that plastic is actually, natural mineral to give it some physical and mechanical properties that people are looking for. And what we're finding is that we can embed CO2 into that mineral component of that end product and sequester carbon and create a better product. Like it actually performs better by having some improved mechanical performance as well. So overall, I think, I'm maybe getting into the weeds here a little bit, but ultimately we want to be the most impactful carbon tech company over the next 10 years. And we think that we can do that by showing ourselves to be relevant, not just to cement and concrete companies, but also to companies that are making, bioplastics in the next 2 to 3 years, companies that are making sustainable retail products like planters and yoga mats and things like that. And really the more, products in modern life that we can embed our technology and our CO2 embedded material into, the more our odds are better of having achieved the impact that we're striving for. So yeah, the biggest challenges in doing that, I mean, some of them are technical, many of them are economic, because, as much as, I mean, the sad truth is that as much as people are beginning to realize the impact and the urgency of this carbon emission problem that we have, like I'm in Calgary right now, like that's where I'm based, and you can still see the smog from all the fires up in Oregon and, the Pacific Northwest and BC. And yet, when you talk to investors, when you talk to a lot of customers, price and economics are a huge part of how they make their decisions. And so I would say a majority of my time currently in trying to figure out how to scale this work is actually trying to convince them with an economic value proposition that is also in line with, their expectations, because the environmental argument alone isn't enough for some of these guys to change their mind.
Yeah, that's the trick, because it's kind of abstract, we don't live in a system that's set up to have the collective damage impact the individuals. So you can kind of skirt free on any kind of big negative consequence of your actions. So that's probably an unhealthy dynamic overall. But cool things are happening to take responsibility on a collective level. And it sounds like you're finding the ways to use the system as it's designed to find those efficiencies and find those value propositions and say, look, I'm not coming at you with just some, moral dilemma. This is actually smarter. You will actually get further with the same amount of resources if you do it this way. And why wouldn't it work that way? It sounds like, I mean, if you're talking about gathering waste and doing something valuable with it, that seems like a very no-brainer. Like, why don't we already do that? So that's sort of my question. You're mentioning ash and wollastonite, which that's a new one. I hope we can kind of dig into that a little deeper, since I don't really know what that is, and I'm sure actually, let's do a quick survey. Who up here who's got a microphone they can unmute knows what wollastonite is, or should we let Apoorv break that down for us?
Well, at least it was in the context of minerals that would take up CO2 in certain circumstances. I'm not familiar with a specific mineral, but many of those minerals can be. So, Apoorv, I'm much more curious of getting into the weeds a little further on that.
Yeah, you apologize for getting into the weeds. We want you to go into the weeds.
It's welcomed here.
No, I appreciate that. I tend to get myself in trouble with fairly long-winded answers usually, especially when there's kind of a time constraint involved. But no, I appreciate the permission. So Serena is exactly right. Like it's essentially a one type of mineral. Wollastonite is fairly heavy in magnesium oxide. If you look through the periodic table, the second column that you see from the left is what's referred to as the alkali earth metal oxide. So these are materials like calcium, magnesium, barium's in there. These are very abundant minerals. Like, minerals, I guess is not the right word, but the metals that are in that column are mostly very abundant in the world. Most rocks that you'll see around rivers, mountains, even shale rock and stuff in areas that are more sandy, they tend to have a lot of these minerals. I think to your point, Arin, I think what we've been trying to do is trying to combine that waste management element to the carbon sequestration piece, because a lot of the work over the last few years in the carbon technology or the carbon tech industry has been around creating these synthetic molecules that can capture CO2 from like a flue stack, or a chimney or something like that, and then find another use for it. And our thinking was like fundamentally, I think a big difference in how carbon upcycling approached this versus some of these other companies that are looking at capture was they were looking to capture it just to release it again. So like generally, if you see a big power plant, like a natural gas power plant or a coal power plant, they emit, all of that the plumes that you see, only about 4 to 15% of that is CO2. For steel and cement plants, which do that more for kind of chemistry intensive reasons as opposed to just energy requirements, even their kind of emission from the flue stack is only about 10 to 20% CO2. The rest is like water vapor, nitrogen, and oxygen, like fairly benign gases that don't really have kind of a negative impact on the environment necessarily. But the CO2 is only a small portion. And so a lot of companies that are doing work on direct air capture or point source emission capture, they're looking at getting that 4 or 10% CO2 or 400 ppm breathing air CO2 up to like 98 or 99% purity so that it can be fed, either into a saline aquifer for storage or to a technology for utilization. In our case, I think, wollastonite is just one example, but a whole range of minerals. There's a family of rocks called mafic or ultramafic rocks. These are basically like high pH rocks, like just to bring you back to high school chemistry a little bit, rocks with a baseline pH of over 7. CO2 in generally is basically an oxidizer, so it acts as an acid. So as long as you've got something that has a pH of over 7, CO2 can neutralize that and actually create a carbonate that will be a fairly stable form of sequestration of CO2. And so the idea is to track down as many of these high pH tailings or waste ash or incinerator ash from waste, incineration plants, or any other type of waste, like from mining operations and such, that we can activate to capture the CO2. Because to your point, it makes economic sense because like dealing with waste is expensive. It's not making anyone any money. So if you're taking that away from people, using that for a common good of handling or tackling CO2 emissions, there's definitely value there. And I think to your point from earlier, Arin, like that is the problem with capitalism right now, I guess, fundamentally, is that a lot of the negative externalities of climate change are not, they're not being attributed back to the people that are causing it necessarily. And so society writ large needs to come up with a solution to do that. I'll be the first to admit that like the approach that we're taking is only one part of the problem or one part of the solution to the problem, but it's going to need like an array of different pathways, like some of the ones that you guys are looking at with the biological take as well to really make it work. But in a nutshell, I guess the idea around wollastonite and these other minerals is just to find stuff that's cheaply available, that's ubiquitous around the world, so that you're not just kind of forced to do all of this in, I don't know, Scandinavia somewhere. You can do it wherever you want. And then, make the economics viable as well. So wollastonite is just one, but I mean, I could list off, 30 or 40. We actually have like this database internally where we track a few of these, and we've got probably 15 or 20 different types of waste, industrial wastes, and probably 40 or 50 type of mineral ores that we've been testing or are in the queue to be tested here over the next little bit.
Wow, that's okay. So I like how thorough you. It sounds like you're scouring for any almost like puzzle piece. Like, what is the molecular puzzle piece that would do what we need to do, and then how can we create value out of that? So back to the innovation concept, it definitely does sound innovative, and maybe this is the answer to the question, like, why don't we already do this? There's probably a whole bunch of examples where there is a circular use of where the waste comes back in and gets utilized. But if it is this exhaustive to find these unique combinations, maybe they're just, it may just be that humanity has not uncovered every knowable thing. In fact, we may just be at the very tip of the iceberg of way more information than is currently known or definitely, utilized. So is that a good way of describing what's going on? That you're digging into all of the combinations to figure out what matches up best, and then when you've got it, you're like, aha, this is a way to actually trap some of the CO2 while also doing something valuable that has some economic value.
Exactly. I think you condensed that really well. you're right. Like there is a lot of kind of baseline research work that has happened, but it hasn't necessarily, dug the surface deep enough or peel the onion enough to be able to really see what the consequences are. Like, to give you a very simple example, like there's a group we work with at UBC. They've been doing a lot of work on mineralization of CO2 just for emission abatement, not necessarily to make an end product that has some economic value, but just, offering essentially carbon sequestration as a service. And one of the things that they haven't done, which is mind-boggling to me, I mean, it's good that they're starting to do it now, but they haven't yet figured out what level of carbon taxation would make which ores attractive to carry out the sequestration in. So what I mean by that is, there are some mineral tailings that you could cost effectively sequester millions of tons of carbon emissions into today if you were getting 40 or 50 bucks a ton for that service. There's a whole range of other rocks that would become financially viable to do that with if the carbon pricing regime was up at 100 bucks a ton. But the interesting thing is that some of the world leading subject matter experts in this field would not currently, like, if you were to call them today and say, hey, give me a list of, which locations could I do carbon sequestration at 50 bucks a ton to get 10 million tons out of the atmosphere, they couldn't really give you that answer. If you ask the next question of like, how much would that pie grow if I could do this at 100 bucks a ton? Again, that answer isn't there. So I think, it kind of, overall, with the complexity of the problem at hand, I think the fact that so many people are looking at so many different things and no one's actually synthesizing it necessarily into a deliberate kind of systemic solution or at least a database where someone can ask those high-level questions and get some nuanced answers, I think that's a challenge. And I think it's becoming, I think it's just a matter of time before that begins to come together. But I think most of it is going to happen through organic kind of network building and, people making friends with folks that they wouldn't generally hang out with or speak to, right? Like, I think the more connections and collisions we can have in the ecosystem so that those kind of questions get posed more, so that the geologist researcher, in Vancouver or elsewhere is actually starting to think about what a policy analyst might want to hear or what an engineer might want to see as they look at scaling this up into a mining facility or something. Those pieces don't just come together, without some level of deliberation and design. And so, yeah, the more people can talk, even when their work isn't directly relevant to each other, on a tactical level, I think the better our odds are of being able to answer these questions better.
I wanted to pass it to Natasha. Can you let Apoorv know just a little bit of context of your background, and I'm interested in your commentary on, is there a growing, I guess, database of mineralization or a growing interest from a geology perspective on where can we cram all this CO2?
Absolutely. Hi, Apoorv. Thanks again for your time. So I'm currently a marine geologist. My specialism right now is in deep sea research. Currently I'm studying deep sea processes, specifically underwater avalanches. And I liked what you said a lot about collaboration, because that's something that's important to me, and how you're saying this range of stakeholders kind of needs to be communicating with each other. That's something I encounter a lot in my own research. I think it's really important. Arin, to answer your question a little bit more, personally, I think that it's quite new and there's still a lot that needs to be done. I also collaborate with UBC, Apoorv, and I agree. I think there's just... Personally, I need to tread carefully here because, again, it's not specifically the field that I work directly in. I have a lot of indirect experience, but from that experience, what I see is that, especially within the UK, it's about kind of injection into the rocks. And as Apoorv's already mentioned, I don't think that that's kind of a long-term feasible goal, because you get this kind of remobilization of it back into the atmosphere at a certain point. So personally, Arin, in terms of a database and this kind of globalization of mineral tech-based technology, I haven't seen it yet. I don't think it's very prolific, let's say, but the research is very up and coming. the things that I'm aware of at the moment in the UK is specifically, I think it was, actually it would be my California-based collaboration. So Dr. Pete McGrail at Apoorv, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Pete.
No, I'm not.
He's at Northwest National Lab, I'm pretty sure. And there, I think what they're looking at is, it's kind of the same as what everyone else is doing, is putting carbon dioxide into the rock to turn it into a carbonate rock, basically. So they're trying to inject thousands of tons of CO2 dissolved in this water. In particular, they're targeting volcanic rocks. So just to zoom out for people a little bit here, when Apoorv was mentioning mafic and ultramafic rock, what that's basically talking about is igneous rock, so rock that originates from the Earth's crust. That's what generally people are using because CO2 precipitates in that rock as a new limestone rock, which is what I was calling a carbonate there. So that's just kind of my overall take on it, Arin. I kind of don't want to go into a great amount of detail here because I don't want to take it too technical if that's not where we're going with it. I'm happy to hear Apoorv's kind of response to that and then go further if anyone else wants to hear.
Yeah, Natasha, I think it seems like we're in agreement here as to kind of where things are at. I am very excited as well about where it seems to be headed. I think there's a significant change in the rate at which data is being collected and the way the questions are being asked. We're working with Greg Dipple at the UBC specifically around some of those questions, and also trying to see if some of the activation work that we're doing could be more relevant to unlocking, carbon sequestration potential in some of these ores. But I think I agree with everything that you said there. Like overall, there are pockets of kind of action right now. I think the challenge is to kind of bring that into a cohesive whole. And I think I'll just share one last point, which might be a little bit of a tangent here. But one of the things that concerns me right now is that there is a whole bunch of hype building up around this space as well. And I'm not necessarily sure that it's all being directed to like the right type of endeavors or the right companies or organizations. There is that balance, I guess, in any kind of a free market where you're trying to balance, the ambitions and the short-term interests that founders and their investors and stuff have against like the overall good. And obviously that needs to happen over a longer time frame. Just really not convinced that is necessarily balanced right now. Going back to one of the things that I said earlier, I'm seeing, at least in the carbon tech, like the carbon utilization space, a lot of money go towards a few people and not necessarily the best companies, and not a lot being littered, to the whole kind of space to enable more kind of micro action. And I think that's a concern because we've seen what happened with the clean tech crash back in the early or the mid 2000s. There was a whole bunch of support and buzz, like the government created a lot of pull for that work in renewable energy and things like that. But it ended up then crashing before it revived again. And really every crash in clean tech from now till 2030 or 2050 is super critical to seeing what kind of momentum we build and what type of people get involved, how many of them stay involved over the long term. And so, I don't know, I think we need like a fact-based kind of principle-driven approach to investment. It's not just a thing of like, throwing money at some players and expecting them to solve everything. I think it has to be done in a better way than I think is being done, at least in many cases that I see.
Well, it seems like... Yeah, go ahead, Serena. Go ahead.
I'm curious in terms of the upcycling aspect of it. There's some perspective where sequestration is an end state for some and a beginning to a downstream process for others. In the sense of when you're scouting or prospecting for different minerals, is part of your criteria looking at once the first capture process is in hand, are there downstream chemistries to upcycle the carbon in a form perhaps in terms of carbon fiber type materials or other types of materials that could or would be more resistant to finding their way back into the carbon cycle, but or in terms of in other types of consumer or construction type material feeds.
Yeah. No, I think I catch the drift of your question. So, I would say that our value prop is very much to see how once that CO2 has been mineralized into a solid form, what additional beneficial impact can it have in, I'll give you a specific example here, like through the displacement of a higher carbon footprint material. So in the case of cement, for example, concrete is a mix of cement, sand, gravel, and water. Cement makes up 90% of the emissions of any concrete, and concrete as a whole makes up about 8% of global emissions every year. What we're finding with the mineralization process that I described earlier is that if we sequester some of the CO2 into ash or, talc or wollastonite or whatever other mineral, we're then able to take that into a concrete facility and actually displace cement. So cement has a very high carbon footprint. You emit about 800 kilos of CO2 per ton of cement produced. What our technology allows us to do, to tackle the second part of your question, Serena, like about the downstream element, what we're doing is once we've sequestered the CO2 in a reactor, and we have a 20-ton a day reactor that we're running in Canada since the third week of April, and actually working with the concrete companies here, like including Wholesome, which is the world's largest cement company. Them and another group in Canada is actually buying our product on a weekly basis and deploying it into the field. And basically what they're doing is to add to the carbon that we sequester in our product, they're then using this, CO2 embedded ash to displace cement in their mix design. So if they used to use, to give you an example for a sidewalk, if they used to use 300 kilos of cement in a cubic meter of concrete, they've now cut that down by 30 or 50 kilos, and they're using that much less. And because cement has such a high carbon footprint, you're now not only sequestering the CO2, but you're also abating the emissions that would have otherwise happened if that cement had been used in its reference form or in its base reference mix. So carbon tech in general, like when we talk about carbon cycles, what we're trying to do is, for at least the economically driven kind of portion of it, we not only have to sequester some CO2 directly into our product, but we then also have to displace an expensive and high carbon footprint material in another existing supply chain. And that's, I think, the two-pronged kind of carbon benefit that we always talk about. So, when we have had to do our math for some investors, or even as part of the XPRIZE that recently concluded, one of the main things we had to show folks is that, this is truly scalable. And that, if this was deployed around the world and it captured 20 or 30% of the market, that the emission reductions that we're able to achieve are well into the hundreds of millions of tons of carbon. And the only way that you can get to those numbers, at least with some of the feedstocks we've dealt with so far and where the technology stands today, is by taking both of those factors into account. You can't just only look at the CO2 that you directly sequester. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's awesome.
It does,
any follow-up questions?
It does make sense, and I think it should be much more a part of the equation going forward. That it's not just a question of capturing the CO2, but what do we actually do with that carbon once we have it? And there's a lot of research and questions for new technologies as well as innovative processing there.
Well, and what did we not do because we did it? And so that kind of leads to another curious thing, where obviously energy, concrete, yes, 8%, that's fairly significant, but energy itself is also the lion's share. So have you uncovered in your process anything that could be utilized in the production of energy, such as ingredients for solar panels, or obviously you mentioned adding things that would harden plastics. Many plastics do have minerals put in them. I'm thinking polycarbonate, or, Strain mentioned carbon fiber. These are good for wind turbines, and also, we're looking for plastics that can survive in the ocean and ideally even be resistant to sunlight and not decaying in the sun. So there's UV coating options, and if we can get a hold of stuff that actually was upcycled carbon, that's one of the things we've spent a lot of time also looking into. So I'm curious, can you, maybe you've got stuff that we can use. Have you found anything in those areas?
At an earlier stage. So, when we founded the company back in 2014, one of the first things that we did was, I guess in one sense, we threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. Like, we partnered up with researchers that were working on construction, that were working on energy storage. We did have a project with a group at Waterloo around, creating a coating for solar cells where we could improve the yield from solar cells as well. And, that project has been at a halt here for the last little bit. But yeah, I think, we've looked at energy storage. There are components in a conventional battery and some novel battery systems that have carbon associated with them. So our thinking was that, if we take graphitic or crystallized carbon, sequester CO2 in it, which was actually the first set of experiments we did back in 2014 and 15, can that produce a value-added, higher performing component for a battery, as an example, right? And that kind of stuff is still going. I think capacity-wise, we've focused a lot of our attention recently on construction, just because the scale and the market opportunity there has kind of accelerated probably a little bit faster and come to the fore a little bit faster than we were anticipating. But there's definitely an avid interest, and I think we've built up a pretty good network of researchers to get associated with on stuff like that as well. And, I think the important thing that we look at on some of these secondary angles, I guess, into the market is that it has to be done within a mind frame of having a longer time frame. Like, you can't be expecting within 3 to 6 months necessarily in some of these projects to come up with a minimum viable product. Like, some of this hard tech research does take time, and many times you'll be pleasantly surprised, but you shouldn't be counting on that, and you shouldn't be cutting down projects or eliminating the scope of something in 6 months because you didn't hit the home run right away. And that's why I think, government has such a big part to play in really catalyzing growth in this space, is because patient capital is going to be required. Like, to Natasha's point from earlier, if a lot of these guys are only just now beginning to coalesce and, build up that momentum, just shows you, like, we've known about the impact of climate change for many, many years now, and it's taken till 2021 for much of this to start coming together. Like, that should be a pretty good signal for how long some of this change can take. But yeah, I think I'm not really kind of answering a question specifically, Arin, about like specific angles we've explored, just because like a lot of that, frankly, has been on hold ever since the first wave of COVID hit back in March last year. But we have definitely started some work in that. Like, we've been in touch with a couple of groups that have worked on novel battery systems and, see where our carbon could go into that. But yeah, we haven't necessarily spent a deliberate amount of time on that in the last year and a half.
It is interesting, the time these things take. The plastics industry didn't, rise overnight either, and it has a lot to do with the availability of feedstocks that, where chemistry allows you to make more complex molecules out of simpler ones. And one of the, just in terms of a big picture of having the direct air capture and carbon capture methodologies mature, does introduce a new feedstock that we haven't had before so readily available, in the sense that what are the steps to connect to some of those those well-understood chemistries where rather than petroleum-based feedstocks, we can start to displace the feedstocks upstream with sequestered carbon. And when that becomes economically viable, the kinds of technologies that can be built on that can both leverage the existing ones, but just by its nature of new technology and new feedstocks and new sources just from the air, ultimately, it places a very different level of conditions just in terms of the geographical opportunities that these technologies could be leveraged, as well as the specific technologies and how they scale. So it's fascinating to take this sort of fresh look at the resources that are available and how we can best develop these technologies into these new feedstocks.
I'd add one caveat there, though, Serena, which is the initial, capital cost of deploying some of this tech. And also, I guess, coupled with the readiness level of the technology itself. Like, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like, having so much of this resource, I mean, I guess it's a waste right now, but like reconfiguring our thought process to look at that as a resource that is available all around the world and stuff is absolutely it completely changes the paradigm on what is possible. I think the challenge is, it's not available in a usable form, right? Like, so it has to be taken up from these low concentrations up to something that can be fed into many processes. And then secondly, you have to realize that these hardware technologies, I mean, we look at software right now and there's always this notion that, you can build a unicorn in the software world in 2 to 3 years, maybe even less. Yes, that is possible, but that has come at the back of, all this fundamental research work that happened in building up the internet, that happened in building up cloud infrastructure. You look at, even smartphones, like a lot of the technologies that were used by Apple and other companies to come up with smartphones were developed with painstaking kind of long-term efforts by the Xerox Spark in Palo Alto. Like, it took them, I think, about 10 or 15 years before some of the core processes, like even a touch-friendly screen and stuff like that came together. So I think we're in that phase now where a lot of that hard work on enabling that type of economic transformation that you're talking about, Serena, is going to happen, but it's going to need some patient capital, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. And I think then we'll really, I hope anyway, that it'd be faster than that, but I'd absolutely, almost bet on the fact that by 2025 or 2030, a lot of these changes will be significantly on the move, where like even some of the people that don't believe it now will have nothing to necessarily argue against.
Apoorv, I just had another question for you, a follow-up there. I like a lot what you said about funding and how it can be, in some cases quite contradictory, because funders require, these radical solutions within sometimes these unrealistically short timeframes, which kind of creates a bias towards less effective solutions that maybe would score higher because of a stronger proof of concept, yet the overall idea may not be as step changing because there's not that time given that's needed. And you've mentioned a lot about economic drivers. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts a little bit on whether you see a trend amongst kind of funding rounds and prizes in terms of, there's mineralization, ocean, air, all these different types of carbon storage. If there's one maybe that's being a little bit more favored in a way because of the way that funding rounds are actually structured?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, from my standpoint right now, like just, again, more so as someone in the field than someone who's, an analyst and an investment bank or something. But like generally, I think there's a whole bunch of work happening on direct air capture, which I think is great, but I don't think that it's, that needs to be looked at from the lens of almost as, planning for the worst case scenario. I think I see a big discrepancy right now where you've got ethanol plants in Iowa, in Illinois, in many parts of Brazil, for example, that are emitting 99% pure CO2 into the atmosphere. And yet, instead of finding ways to use that and close the loop at these areas where you have to do almost zero work to capture that CO2, instead people are pouring in, hundreds of millions of dollars into direct air capture, and kind of hyping that up. And I'm not, I'm saying all that to draw a contrast for not the reason that you might, I want to clarify as to what I'm not trying to say. I'm not trying to say that direct air capture should not be getting that funding. What I'm trying to say is that there are other pieces of this entire kind of value chain that should be receiving just as much, if not more attention. So if you've already got, that purity of CO2 available, and, it adds up to, 300 or 400 million tons a year across the world, to me, that's a low-hanging fruit. And considerable amount of resources and, prizes and grants and private funding needs to be going towards that, as opposed to just looking at DAC and doing a couple of exciting headlines on that front. I think that's probably the one piece that I find, frankly, a little bit frustrating, because what ends up happening is that, this is where the disconnect between private and like individual interests is quite contrasting to like the overall public need or public good. Because really, I mean, someone saying that they can create, I'm just going to give you an example, like fuels from, carbon from the carbon that we breathe from the air is great. Well, I mean, and this might be the engineer in me who's, less risk averse and like thinks of things as kind of stepwise, as opposed to just, rocking up one day with a solution at hand. But like my first thought to someone who proposes that would be to say, look, if you can do that, if you can make a fuel from 400 parts per million CO2 in the air, why don't you first show to me that you can make fuel with 99% CO2 from an ethanol plant like 10 miles away from Chicago, and get Chicago off of normal fuels so they'd never have to drill in the Bakken again or something, or the Marcellus, I guess, out in the Midwest. And yet that's not happening, and I don't even frankly know if those questions are being asked. But I do agree with you, like to answer the second part of your question, and I'm not sure how controversial what I just said is going to land as. I know that a couple of investors I've talked to tend to kind of just shrug and say, oh, that's how it works. But I don't think that's a good enough answer, frankly. But the second part I would say is that there are definitely areas that are not getting enough attention. Like I think biological sequestration, geological sequestration, to what you talked about, Natasha, outside of just looking at saline aquifer storage, I don't think it's getting enough attention at all. And, there might be some good changes there. Like I know Heirloom just raised, I don't know how much they raised, but I know that I saw an announcement there a month or so ago about them raising some money around using the magnesium oxide looping work. That's pretty interesting. I think that kind of stuff, bodes well. But definitely, there are definitely pockets here that are being completely underfunded and undersupported. And it's interesting. I'll just finish by saying this on this question. If we look at funding as like a way of just allocating resources, so let's not think about it from the perspective of money as, making some people rich or poor. But if we think of it societally as saying, we're going to put more resources and more funding towards things that we think are important, really, if there is policy and, a high level agreement between corporates and governments that climate change is one of the biggest, if not the biggest societal kind of problem that we're going to face over the next 80 or 90 years, there is a massive difference between, the level of funding that video gaming receives or certain software startups receive compared to the type of funding that is available for carbon utilization or carbon capture solutions and things like that. And I think at some level, that is a pretty good high-level metric to track over time. Like, again, I don't expect that to fix overnight, but overall, this field needs to be a lot bigger than some other fields that are a lot more lucrative. And it's not there yet. And I don't think that this is, you hear about this in economics, like why does an athlete make way more, like a high-level NFL athlete make way more than a teacher? And, there are some arguments there that I think, whether you agree with them or not, are at least rational. I don't think necessarily that those kind of arguments hold true for this. Like, this is a systemic problem. the right type of technology, like the ones you guys are working on, or we are, or whatever, like there's, a whole host of companies, these are globally relevant solutions. So they should be treated with, the same level of funding or resource allocation as is being funded to other stuff that has much less impact, in my opinion. But of course, I'm probably preaching to the choir there, but
Well, you do
I'll
bring
pause
up
for
a good point. Certainly from the engineering perspective of what you rightfully called low-hanging fruit. If you already have concentrated CO2, why don't you explore upcycling technologies with that? And it's interesting. My initial interests were in upcycling CO2 to methanol. And there were a number of technologies and a number of promising companies. And they'd get to a developed, mature technology and a medium-sized company, and lo and behold, a big energy company would buy them and they'd disappear. Or you mentioned the ethanol, in Iowa. There's, you see corn farmers converting to ethanol plants because of certain incentives. But the corn lobbying in the United States is anything but rational. It's highly politicized, and there hasn't been a sufficient engineering criteria. How's that for diplomacy? That's been applied to who gets what for what. I fully agree. There's not just there are entrenched businesses that present barriers and active predation to innovation, and in addition to that, these new technologies are threats to ways of life and jobs and business models, and those have pushback at political levels. And it is a very difficult problem, and and part of how we're addressing that is to avoid ways that we can so easily be stopped by non-technical reasons, committees, jurisdictions, and so forth. But yeah, it's a recognizably deep aspect of the problem is that's not that pure innovation alone won't solve.
Well, and I'm curious, Apoorv, how is it that you plan to tackle this problem? I mean, I think we're all in agreement. But if one had a clever path in mind, like, well, I'll introduce this product and that'll be clearly valuable to this sector, and then that can lead to this. Is there a plan, or are you actually still gathering options and still developing?
Yeah, I'd say that we have a semblance of a plan, and I would say that there's also a lot of ambiguity in the plan. Just with I guess like you can put that in the category of hope. We're just hoping that some of these things happen the way we think they need to happen, and I think much of that boils down to the fundamental thesis for anyone looking at the carbon cycle, which is that we're genuinely serious about solving this problem, right? Like, I think there is, and I'll be completely blunt here, I'm not convinced that a lot of people that are even putting money in, like there are people and groups that are putting millions and millions of dollars into this sector right now, and I'm not convinced that all of them are doing it for the right reasons, and they're not necessarily doing it because they have absolutely agreed that the train's leaving the station and they have to jump on board with this climate mitigation work. I think that is especially for those of us that have been in the space for a while and expect to see their entire careers kind of being spent in that. I would imagine that is a big threat in that we need to be able to stay the course, and we need to be convinced that things are going to get easier, not tougher. That if there is carbon pricing mechanism that's going to go on online, it's going to be favorable, not the other way around. That what you guys pulled off in the States there 4 years ago, that really was an anomaly, and you're not going to elect a president that gets you out of the Paris Accord and things like that in the future. And I think overall, as long as, of course there are going to be bumps along the road, and it's not going to be a perfect trajectory, but I think that would be the part that I have the least level of kind of I guess, planning around. It's just, there's an anticipation that the news that we'll see will be positive. But what we can plan around is just, where do we draw the box of impact, right? And so, like, specifically in our case, I think the reason that we've been so focused on construction right now is because we see a clear line of sight to how to get to 100 or 200 million tons of emission reductions within a period of time. Like, I wouldn't say necessarily that, it's going to happen in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but we think that within a decade, we could be in that 100 million tons plus emission reduction kind of range. A lot of things have to fall into place, but the main things that we need to show are, one, the carbon reduction impact is significant. It's in the double digits at the very least. The second thing is that it's economically cheap enough that it doesn't, make the counterparty walk out of the room, right? So I think those are the two main things that we feel we have control over, and where the hope and other factors like that come in, I think, is that as, if we're right, that this type of movement and kind of, putting a price on pollution and stuff like that is all actually going to happen. And we can get into the whole philosophical debate about whether carbon pricing needs to be a tax or not, because I think that is a really important thing for people to consciously think about. But whatever pricing mechanism does happen, whatever societal pressures are there, they do actually make this more favorable, so that if we're solving the problem in today's market conditions, in 2024, those cement companies are only going to like our solution better. And hopefully by that time, we've made more headway with things like bioplastics or some of the work we're trying to do on energy storage and things like that. And that's where I think the partnership stuff becomes so exciting, because you get to meet with subject matter experts and collaborate. And I think the more, groups like the ones Natasha mentioned and Serena has talked about, like, the more this value chain and like people in this market get further along, I think the higher likelihood that we're going to find more of these collisions, and different groups doing very different things are going to come together and add synergy and stuff. So that excites me, but we're not counting on that piece. For us right now, it's just taking one chunk of the problem, which for us is the construction sector, and showing ourselves to be credible solutions for that, and then hopefully using that credibility to get involved in other stuff, like either during or after that journey.
And so is this going to be in the form of concrete, or what other construction ingredients or materials do you think you'll be developing in the next, let's say, year to two, or making available in the marketplace for people who buy construction parts?
Yeah, so there is one other angle. I mean, I should say that, like, the heavy majority of that work will be concrete. There's, for every human being on the planet, there's 3 tons of concrete poured into the ground every year. So, it might seem like it's only one thing, but it's a huge market, right? Like, there's nothing that humans use more than concrete except water. And so if we get even, a chunk of that market over the next 3 to 5 years, like, we'll be having some meaningful impact. But having said that, there are other angles we're looking at, such as, like, corrosion protection coatings and additives that you can use to make concrete more resilient. And I would say, like, for lumber-based infrastructure, like, we've looked at the coating for fire retardation quite actively. We're just kind of in the works of, like, with a testing agency to see if we can get our coating approved for that kind of stuff. Where essentially, like, if you've got a log building or a building made of wood, you can actually coat it with this coating, which can make it significantly more fire retardant. Like, that's basically the value prop we're exploring there. But yeah, I think apart from, like, coatings and actually kind of replacing cement, nothing else jumps to mind for me right now. Yeah.
Thanks, Apoorv. I'm actually going to have to get going, Arin. So I just wanted to say thank you, and just briefly, one last thing to kind of respond to what you were saying, Apoorv, just quickly about kind of why DAC, or direct air capture, is kind of so prolific at the minute. I completely agreed with everything you said, by the way, even if it is controversial. I think, in my opinion, it's to do with the fact that DAC was kind of first developed in collaboration with a petroleum company. And again, a lot of this funding and research and innovation comes from universities in the beginning, and then partnership with industry. So I think once that partnership was formed, and then because a lot of university funding is directly given through governments, there was already quite strong ties formed. Unlike obviously biological methods and even oceanographic ones. And on top of that, the fact that can be proof of concept in a lab, whereas again, we face, especially with pull to refresh at the minute, massive ocean challenges as well, and that makes it very difficult. So just to kind of wrap up here, what you were saying about, organizations seeking to fund the projects they think are the most important and groundbreaking, but what they're actually funding is the cheapest and most efficient concepts to prove. So that was my take on it, and thanks again for your time.
Thanks.
No, likewise. Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks, bye.
Okay, well, so the other topic that we wanted to get into, and we'll take a few more minutes to keep chatting. We've got about 20 more minutes or so. And by the way, we will open it up to questions from people who've been listening in here on Clubhouse. So go ahead and put up your hand if you've got something to share. But I also wanted to hear, what it was like being a part of the XPRIZE, because you've gone through something we're about to be going through. So what should we know, and also what was that like?
Yeah, definitely have some thoughts to share there. I see my colleague Peter has joined the room as well. So I'm sure he'll probably have something to say on that front too. It's interesting. I'll just start this off by sharing a couple of kind of historical context points here. I guess one is that, the company itself is 6.5 years old. The Carbon XPRIZE that we were a part of started about 1.5 years into us founding the company. And so we've pretty much only really known life as an XPRIZE participant. And it was definitely a formative experience for us. I think one of the things that we can attest to is that one of the big positives was that it allowed us and it forced us in one sense to explore scale up way more aggressively than we would have if we hadn't entered the prize. They had, essentially asked us to get to ton level carbon utilization by the end of the finals. We were able to achieve that, and that forced us to go from a reactor that, kind of looks, just a little bit bigger than a normal cookie jar is kind of what we had when we first entered the prize, to a unit that's huge. It's 30 feet long and about 14 feet in diameter. And, going from that small scale to the big one in the short amount of time that we did with a small team and, bootstrapping was an experience that we have to give full credit to the XPRIZE for. Like they put the challenge in front of us. They incentivized it with a prize. They also, just with the pull of the prize, there were a whole range of agencies that started looking at funding work that we were doing and other participants were doing that, frankly, probably without that prize being the focal point for the industry and some of these solutions, probably would not have happened. Like it would have been less likely anyway, even if it were to have happened for a few of the entities. So I think that's the stuff that I remember very fondly. I think the one kind of drawback, I suppose, of how the prize was ultimately run and delivered is, just like for anyone who's ever played a sport, like we want to get feedback during the game. Like you want to get feedback real time. And I think that was one of the pieces, and we've already talked to the XPRIZE since the prize was wrapped up as well, that they didn't necessarily give transparency and, I guess running it more like an incubator or an accelerator to get the companies and teams ready for the real world weren't really two things that the XPRIZE did well at all. They weren't very transparent, and ultimately the adjudication process wasn't necessarily in line with how the industry or kind of the world sees these solutions. And that's, I think, two things that I would caution like pull to refresh on and other teams on is that just be mindful that winning or losing the XPRIZE is ultimately not a good barometer for success in the real world. And so a lot of the commercial work, a lot of the commercial traction and partnership work that you have to do to scale your solution and make a meaningful impact in a perfect world, and if the XPRIZE this time is run better than it was the last time, these things would happen. They'd be married with each other. You wouldn't have to do anything extra for one versus the other. But unfortunately, there was a disconnect between those two elements. And so that, coupled with the lack of transparency, I think, creates a bit of I guess just a warning sign, I suppose, just to not take the prize as a be all and end all, but rather just as one of the efforts to take on while doing other things that you need to be successful. And I'll just say, it was a fun time. I mean, a lot of it was very painful. There was a lot of crazy amounts of work. I think, Peter, I'm not sure if you can, I think maybe he is in the speaker section here. Maybe I'll kind of let you speak to this a little bit, Peter. But if I remember correctly, from July to December, we worked 14 or 16 hour days, 7 days a week, without taking a day off or something like that. And I think it was like that for a few of our core team members, if I recall correctly.
We just lost Peter. That may have been a glitch with the app, but
okay.
Hopefully we'll hear from him. And but of course we know exactly what I'm laughing over here. We know exactly what you're talking about in terms of the workload. But yeah, and it's very interesting to hear about the judging process. Yeah, because it does seem a little bit kind of encrypted. How are you going to evaluate this? Very, very little information is provided. Just these very stark targets. But at the same time, you're mentioning that target to hit the ton. It's possible that the critique is actually just a trade-off of the benefit. That in order to have such a clear and concise, here is our target, here's where we're going, like the Lunar XPRIZE, for example, fly for something like 100 meters on the moon and then land and then get some HD footage and send it back. I may be quoting that slightly wrong, but it's something along those lines. And that's an ongoing XPRIZE that's happening. By having it so clear, you can put together a team to say, okay, well, then how would we do that? There's a lot of other things we could do, but we're going to do that. And that kind of focus might actually require not too much meddling or steering or even reference to the industry as a whole. Because does the industry really need that footage from the moon? Not really, but it's an interesting literal moon shot. So as that applies to the current XPRIZE, which I have a question for you about, they're saying that they want 1,000 tons now because this is gigaton scale, and they figure, I'm thinking that if you can't get to 1,000, how can you get to 1 billion? So so that's forcing, in the same way you just described, it's forcing us to look at okay, so 1,000, how could we demonstrate within the time period of this competition 1,000 tons? And that, inevitably forces us to look directly at that target and nothing else, and stay completely focused, and also not get caught up in well, what does the industry think we should do in terms of getting to 1,000? Well, they seem to think this, and these things are getting investment, and that's happening. But in a way, it's kind of let's tune all of that out, because there's no reason to think that any of that's correct. It's just what is. And as Natasha said before she left, maybe those are just the things easiest to demonstrate. So then your demonstration just gets you funded. But that's not the real answer that humanity is looking for. So it's interesting that you state that as the positives and negatives. And that is very helpful for us to hear and to think about. And but I'm curious, why not participate in this XPRIZE?
So first off, I just wanted to add one thing to what you said. I agree with how you frame that. And I'm glad that my point about, the discrete challenges with the business related solutions and what the prize defines as the challenge, I'm glad that we're in agreement there. The one thing I would say is, impact, especially for a problem like this, is going to need collaboration. And, I can definitely tell you that I shouldn't say definitely, but my view is that you're going to have way more likelihood of success if as if we stick to that moon challenge that you talked about, if you can combine that also with industry needs that people are willing to mobilize around, right? Because the prize is going to end.
True.
And it's not a steady state of or steady kind of continuation over a period of time. Whereas like if you're able to create those industry engagements, if you're able to create a group to collaborate with that is scaling your solution, even if you didn't make it through the first round of the XPRIZE, you could be at the end of the XPRIZE when someone else has been announced the winner and be much further ahead because you've actually come up with something that is solving the real world. Like ultimately, I think it's good to think of the XPRIZE as a model or a simulation of the real world. And just like any simulation, it doesn't capture it perfectly. In fact, I'm sure the XPRIZE, like the operating team for the XPRIZE will be the first to admit that what they have is an oversimplified kind of is a version of the real world and the challenge at hand. But
as any game probably should.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, or else you just play real life. And I think what they exactly to the point that you said about like the moonshot piece, like they've set a generic kind of goal, and they said that at the end of this, if 30 groups get to that, and we pick one winner, the rest lose or whatever it is. I think they have 2 or 3 winners in this one. So like, where do the other ones go? And I think the answer would be in terms of like the public good and why open innovation is a cool model is even if that prize is run very badly, like Serena talked a little bit earlier about, some of the political forces at play with like, fuels, like ethanol related stuff as an example, or the methanol space, like I'm not saying that the XPRIZE would be political, but I'm saying, you just never know how these things play out. And if you don't, and you're one of the 28 or so that didn't win, but you've been able to make headway now, like you said, you've now focused on a problem instead of doing something else, that's already bringing value to the field. And if you're able to actually deliver on this and create a commercial solution along with a few others, I think it works for everyone. Going to your question about why we are or are not competing in this prize, I mean, frankly, I think we haven't thought about it enough. I know that there's still a few months to decide. We are looking at that mineralization pathway that Natasha was referring to a little bit. So we are keeping a door open there. But I think overall, our thinking is that we want to collaborate. And so, I'd be very interested to learn more. Like, I don't know if we're actually going to have time now because I do have to bail in a few. But I'd be very curious to learn more about your team and what you guys are doing and see if there's any kind of overlap there or something. But yeah, I think if we were to do it, just with kind of our priorities as a business and stuff right now, I don't think that we do it alone. But yeah, that's kind of where we stand. I wouldn't say that we've ruled it out completely. Like there are a couple of pathways we're looking at, but yeah, at this point, like nothing like tangible on the ground has happened to make it work.
Okay, well that's a good answer because at least you didn't say like
follow-up. We would be interested in speaking further. I think there are some ways to, in terms of the upstream and downstream processing chains, there may be some real opportunities to collaborate. So certainly.
And I'm really glad you didn't say that you're not participating because of something about the last time. So it almost sounds like, the XPRIZE was a success for you, is what it sounds like. That maybe you wish that that maybe more incubation or handoffs to other opportunities are a part of the community. But maybe the conversations we're having right now and actually teams' abilities to find each other and have conversations and form, like you said, collaborations. Maybe that's our part of it. That's maybe where we come in. Is if that's what we want to see, we simply add it.
I will add one thing, Arin, just in the interest of full disclosure. If we hadn't received some of the feedback that we did after the XPRIZE, that makes me believe that they're going to run this one better. My initial impression after the XPRIZE was finished was to actually kind of discourage people from spending time on it. Like, I am frankly very disillusioned by the adjudication process that went on the last go around. And I'll be very kind of candid about where that comes from. I think, one thing was, we're building, and as will you in this prize, we're building physical infrastructure, right? And the judges never actually came out to the site to see it. Like they never even held a virtual presentation from the teams for us to be able to show them what we built. They sent the operating team down on a couple of occasions for a couple of days, and they had them kind of look at things, in a very kind of small period of time. And, you're building this stuff up over a year and a half, 2 years. You're taking, like I said, I think our approach was to combine what we knew we had to show for the prize with what we had to show to an end customer, so that whether we win the prize or not, we actually have a customer that still likes how we've done this. So we were taking a lot of input in from the end users. And given the lack of communication we had with the judges and any type of feedback during the whole finals round, we were completely in the dark as to how that affected our chances well or not during the prize. And I think that was and it's frankly, like, it's just unrealistic. Like, you never play a game with the referee coming to you after the game and saying, this is how you should have played because you fouled here, here, and here, at this time. Like, you get real-time feedback and you change your game, you change your, the players on the field if you need to sub them out. I mean, it has to be a responsive game. And the argument or the feedback that we gave to the XPRIZE folks was that if they're not going to be transparent like that, it not only, I mean, I know they're doing it to a certain extent because they don't want to be liable for stuff and things like that. Like, there are many legal reasons behind it. But from a public good, and like, if they're trying to make this into an enabler for all technologies, not just the winners, they really have to provide that kind of service, because that's where the real value is. Like, if halfway through, sticking to your moon picture example, if halfway through that they say, well, we want you to pick a tech, I don't know, like that actually allows you to do this in more kind of extreme environments, like in Venus or something as well, that might completely change how you invest your money and time and your team's efforts over the next 6 months, right? Like, but you won't know that if they don't tell you that. And so you might just go down a completely different path and just be worse off for it, or at least not better off where you could have been. So yeah, I mean, I did want to make sure, in the interest of candor, I suppose, like, just wanted to make sure that I'm very unhappy with how that last adjudication process happened, frankly. But I do believe that there's genuine interest from the XPRIZE to do it differently. And this is arbitrary stuff. Like, at the end of the day, whether carbon upcycling becomes an impactful carbon tech company or not is not going to go down to whether we won the prize or not. Like, we won a prize, we didn't win the grand prize, but ultimately, the real marker of success is going to be the millions, or ideally hundreds of millions of tons of carbon that we're able to sequester. And the XPRIZE is just a part of that journey. It's by no means the journey.
Well, thank you, Apoorv, for joining us. And if you need to hop off, I know we have a hard end coming up. I did want to pass it to Sagar, who's on our stage. Did you have a question or comment for Apoorv? Who's been patiently waiting, because we like to invite up audience members to chime in. Also, we have Eli, who's a good friend here on Clubhouse, who's also competing in the XPRIZE for the Gigatonne Challenge. Feel free to jump up, Eli. How's it going, Eli?
Hi. Oh, well, lots to deal with. Doing my best. So I just kind of wanted to comment, Apoorv, I'm kind of hoping that you might do a Twitter thread or a LinkedIn post on your suggestions for the XPRIZE. I do know that Marcius Extivor and Xenia, use those platforms and might notice, and hopefully that could be if you approach it as a constructive criticism, maybe it might feed into the way they handled this competition.
Yeah, Eli, everything that I mentioned to you guys here, I have mentioned to them as well. I've just done it in a closed forum, just in the interest of not seeming like I'm bashing the prize. I do take on board what you're saying. Like, I'll see how the next couple of months go, because we're still kind of, the postmortem for the prize is still going on. So, people are looking, and I guess postmortem is maybe a very bad negative connotation phrase there, but like, they are looking at the conclusion of the prize and what they can learn from it and stuff. And so I think behind closed doors, there's a lot of that happening. The trustees are in the chat, the sponsors are conversing with them as well. And so are some of the competitors like us. So, I'll definitely keep that open as an option. I just think that I don't want to, I still have notwithstanding my frustration, I have a huge amount of respect for how the XPRIZE is tackling this and the fact that they have this credible global kind of focal point for open innovation where, people, to Arin's point, like a lot of the people in this room and a lot of people that are going to compete in this new prize could be doing other things, but this is giving them a reason to look at this. And so I don't want to be, debasing that effort or somehow standing in the way of it. I just think that it needs to be done a lot better. And I think they're open to it. So if it gets to a point where I feel that I need to make a public statement on that, rest assured, I don't back down from that kind of stuff. So I'll definitely keep that open.
Well, and consider that you already have, maybe is the point Eli's making, that if in sharing this with us, you may consider, well, we know that they're taking input and feedback, even just on this XPRIZE, how to go about it, how to do it. And yeah, can there be an organization that's more inviting of feedback? I get that impression left and right from them. And I think what we're really probably all in agreement here on is that we love what they're trying to do. No one expects it to be perfect immediately, and we all expect it to get better over time. And so when we know how it can get better, out of a love for what the goal is, we want it to get better. So I think it's all totally fine to have this kind of level of critique and feedback, but also unfortunate because it sounds like you went through a pretty intense experience there, and and feel that there could have been that this information, these adjustments could have been more valuable to you had they not been applied to future XPRIZEs, but been applied to the one that you just dedicated years towards. But overall, sounds like you are happy that it's led to lots of opportunities, and we're rooting for you. We're excited to see if there's any potential collaborations that we can do. Mineralization being added to plastics, we could definitely talk about that. Especially bioplastics that could be originating from kelp, which was one of the many things we're exploring. So let's follow up more in the future.
Sorry, I'd just like to add that there's a different way of approaching the same thing, describing what is most useful to teams in competition or also people applying to incubators, because I've done a little bit of the latter, and a rejection without comment is really, really useless and makes me just not want to ever apply to other incubators. Not because of the rejection, but because it's like there's nothing to be gained in terms of doing it better next time.
I couldn't agree with you more, Eli. Yeah, and you're right. I'll give that some more thought. Like you've definitely raised a good proposition there, and you're right. Like maybe something in the public domain just to talk about the pros and cons, and like to your point, like maybe even directing it to a different audience, not just the XPRIZE, but addressing some of those points would actually be useful. So if give me some time to think about that. Like it's definitely something I have thoughts on, so I don't have to spend a lot of time thinking and drafting what I'm going to say. It's more a matter of kind of choosing the right tone, I suppose. But I think Arin captured it well. Like we all want this kind of an effort to work well. And it's just a matter of, giving that feedback back in a candid but respectful way where it's actually driving the change that you want, as opposed to discouraging them from even going about this. But I couldn't agree with you more, Eli. Like that kind of stuff where, you put your name in the hat and you get no real feedback as to what you could have done better, what was, not done, or what was good, but maybe missed the point. Like, yeah, that's not, it's nice to have that. In fact, I think it should be a necessity to make this kind of a system work better than it currently.
Okay, well, it's time for us to close down this room.
I've got a question very quickly.
Oh, okay. Oh, Sagar, we can hear you now. Okay, go ahead, Sagar.
Sorry, I'm a newbie to this app. Just very quickly on system change. I keep hearing the word system change, and I want to ask this question in terms of supply chains. So, people are talking a lot about carbon sequestration and carbon capture. And if you look at a lot of the minerals, I'm talking about solar panels, wind turbines, the lithium, the cobalt, the bauxite. How much precautionary principle has been applied when looking at these new technologies, when the resources for these technologies have to be mined up from other countries, for which not a small plot of land, maybe the size of my house in London, but huge swathes of forest are having to be deforested to actually extract those minerals and water. So when people are talking about system change, I have to really ask how far back and how inclusive of the whole system is the system change being?
So if I understand right, you're asking the question like, mineralization sounds great, but where are you getting that mineralization? Is that what's going on, Sagar? You're questioning the damage that alone, that extraction could have.
Yes, like for example, any facility that you need is going to be made out of concrete. The base stations of the wind, not the wind turbines, but there's a lot of concrete required in the wind turbines, but the concrete is having to be made by burning coal, by burning fossil fuels. I heard a lot of arguments, people saying that renewables are fossil free. And, then I speak to some of my friends in India and they says, no, there's coal still being mined up, but it's just being mined up for making the concrete required for the wind turbine or the solar, these renewables. So there's two terms. There's one which is precautionary principle, which is that, look before you jump. And then there's the other one, which is unintended consequences. So what is the unintended consequences of going for renewable technologies with actually looking at the unintended consequences of the fact that the renewables are requiring extraction of the same lot of soil and earth that is required for the coal and the fossil fuels? And what is left for those people in some forests in India or some forests somewhere in Africa? Have we really looked at, in full circumspect, have we looked at the full unintended consequences? Like in a part of India, northeast India, when I was speaking to Vandana Shiva a few months ago, she was saying there's northeast India, there's Uttarakhand, which is a very indigenous place. And I says, well, okay, what is the resources you require there? She says, oh, I remember as a 9-year-old girl, she was saying that that place was getting flooded all the time. I says, what was being mined up there? And she was saying bauxite. Well, if you look at the supply chain of bauxite, it's going to lead to renewables. So have we really looked at the full supply chain of these technologies?
So it's a good question, Sagar. We get where you're going with this question. Sure. Go ahead, Apoorv. Because this comes up a lot, right? This is a perspective that many people share. Obviously, we're just trying to get better leverage and make progress forward, and couple steps forward, maybe sometimes one step back. But what's your thought on where this mineralization comes from and how to make that also an environmentally friendly process?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and it's a tough question. First off, I would say, specifically, or I guess I should say broadly speaking, the industry writ large is doing a terrible job at that. So I would say not just for carbon sequestration or mineralization, I would say, to the lithium example that Sagar mentioned, like if you were to try to find right now a number for kilograms of CO2 emitted or environmental impact done through a couple of metrics for every ton of lithium extracted in Chile versus other places, you will find some insanely kind of wide discrepancies in numbers in different places, and you'd be stuck. Like, you wouldn't really know what to believe. In our case, I guess I'll say a couple of things specifically. So one, again, more broadly about carbon tech in general, I think these questions need to be asked more often, not just to us, but to other companies. Because exactly to your point, Sagar, like, I think what ultimately is challenging is that you only see, people draw a box around, let's just say, just this concrete facility or the cement facility where carbon upcycling process may be used. And we're doing all this extra work, energy spend and all that before or after that, which is not being accounted for. And we're just building up these metrics, and sharing them on social media to make ourselves look like these saviors where maybe we're not. And so that level of cradle to, not just gate, but cradle to grave analysis, like the life cycle analyses, where some work has already begun and standardizing those things needs to happen better. Our take on this is twofold as a company. So firstly, when we look at mineralization, we're very much trying to focus on wastes. So even when it comes to mining, as you probably know from like bauxite mining, or if you look at copper and nickel tailings and stuff, about 95 to sometimes 98% of what they actually mine ends up becoming tailing. So that's the stuff that doesn't have the mineral thereafter. When you look at rare earth metal extraction as an example, over 99% of the stuff that they actually excavate and mine and crush is waste. It does nothing at all. It just sits there, and the mine could be, gone for many years, but that tailing gets left behind. With coal power plants as an example, like in Canada right now, what we're working on with one of the big companies here is exploring an idea where the coal power plant has already been decommissioned. They've moved that to natural gas, and the plan is over the next 10, 15 years to move that to a renewable project. But that coal power plant still left behind about 60 million tons of ash that's just sitting as a liability. And so, Duke Energy and Tennessee Valley Authority in the States have very similar problems. India and China, between them, produce about 450 million tons of coal ash a year. And about a third to a half of that ends up sitting in a landfill or a tailing. So from our perspective, when we talk about mineralization, we're tackling those wastes. And the idea is that there's no, at least for the foreseeable future, we're not having to mine new sources to make that work. However, I will say that in areas where we have looked at mining, the intent is to look at only minerals that are available right on the surface, so as to have the least amount of impact from a carbon emission and from an environmental degradation perspective. And frankly, we're very, very early on that second prong. Like, we need to do more homework. But what I can say is, I think, Sagar, I completely agree with you in that work so far has not been done in a way that's very transparent and frankly standardized. And so the challenge is not just on us, but I would say on the industry, like, wholly, to be able to take that head on and be super transparent and say, this is what it looks like from the moment that material is touched all the way out to the end of life. If that's, hopefully it's not in the landfill, but for many of these things it is. And the last thing I'll say here is the concept of baselining, right? So let's say, as an example, that you are mining some new material. And I'm not saying this necessarily from a carbon upcycling perspective, but let's say, there is another company that comes out with an alternative to lithium mining because they've got another active material for a battery. You can't just compare them to zero. You have to compare them against the emissions of lithium mining. Like in our case, if we were to ever look at a new mine, we would compare ourselves to the cost and the environmental impact of cement mining, because that's what we're comparing against. And the thought process there is that, okay, you might not be exactly a zero, but are you significantly better than what is being done to tackle that industry's needs and challenges right now? And I think that's a concept that maybe isn't kind of well thought out or explained in the public vernacular, but that would be an important part of whatever standardization is achieved in this space, I think.
So could I just add something very quickly? You said that 95. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I have a couple of minutes.
Yeah. You were saying 95% of the extractives are tailings which are not even used. So basically, that means only 5% of the resources extracted are used for the renewables. But my problem with that is not the 95%, the 5% is for extracting that 5%, whole forests in Jharkhand in northeast India, the Western Ghats, the Molim forests, are all being fully extracted and deforested right now for the last 10 years, and whole habitats are being destroyed and water's being unsequestered to get that 5% for renewable technologies. Is that correct?
I'm not privy to that at all, Sagar. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, like given some of the stuff I've read in the news about, the Amazonian rainforests and mining and that. I think exactly to your point about, like, I guess it builds on what I was saying about baselining, is that if that's our way of doing business currently, it has to get better. And like if something else is being proposed as a new tech or a new kind of method, it has to be significantly better than that. Because if we're just exacerbating that problem, that's not doing anyone any good.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Sagar, and for tackling that question. We do have to close up the room. So go ahead and follow anyone on the stage who you want to have more conversations with. Also, Clubhouse has a lot of direct messages and new features they've been adding. So, and by the way, it's always a good idea to put in your handles on other social media. Whenever we're here on Clubhouse, we can't always finish the conversations we start, is what I'm trying to say. So, although I know we're not addressing everything you brought up there, Sagar, I don't think it would be possible to do so in this conversation, because there are a lot of problems, and that's actually why we're all doing what we're doing. It would also be really bad if that forest had to, have its entire ecosystem survive a major increase in temperature. That would also be extremely bad for that forest. So there are so many problems, and no one's capable of really actually understanding the consequences of our actions fully. So we're all going to try to do our best to test and adjust, and test and adjust, and that's the best we can do. I think we're all in a giant adjustment right now, which is like, well, that's a lot of CO2 when you look up at the chart that's just like going up and up and up. And so we're trying to figure out, can we not put it there? And that's a big part of this upcycling. Can we take it out? That's also a big part of this XPRIZE Gigatonne challenge that we're a part of. And together, by bringing all these things up, hopefully we're making progress. Little by little, we're making progress. So thank you so much, Apoorv, for joining us in this conversation. I'm going to pass it to Raven, who can let people know more about how to follow what we're doing.
Great. So thank you so much to everybody who joined us today for our talk. So just a reminder, we are Pull to Refresh, a team competing in the Elon Musk Carbon Removal XPRIZE. You can follow along with what we talked about today on our website at pulltorefresh.team. That's TEAM. We've been taking notes on our Miro digital whiteboard, so you can go check that out. Also follow us on all major digital media platforms. Our Instagram is Refreshing Earth, Twitter Pull to Refresh, Facebook, all those good ones. So today we talked to Apoorv Sinha, who is the CEO and founder of Carbon Upcycling Technologies. So thank you so much again for coming on and talking with us. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the team members. We would love to get in touch with you.
All right, everybody. Another good Clubhouse. Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Pull to Refresh podcast. Please remember to leave a review in Apple Podcasts and check out our website, pulltorefresh.team, where you can follow the technology and solutions we are developing.